The yellow school bus pulled up to the gates of Westfield Academy, its brakes squeaking as it came to a stop. Among the few students getting off was Elijah Johnson, a thin 12-year-old boy with bright eyes that darted nervously from the grand brick building to the groups of well-dressed kids chatting on the front lawn. He clutched his second-hand backpack tightly against his chest like a shield. "You got this," Elijah whispered to himself, remembering his mother's words from that morning. She'd woken up extra early after her night shift at the hospital to fix his collar and smooth down his hair before sending him off to his first day. "Show them what you're made of," she'd said, her tired eyes filled with pride and hope. The main hallway of Westfield Academy buzzed with activity. Lockers slammed, sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, and laughter echoed off the high ceilings. Elijah felt like he'd stepped into another world, one far removed from his neighborhood where the streets were loud, but the schools were quiet, with leaky ceilings and outdated textbooks. Principal Wilson, a tall man with kind eyes, led Elijah down the corridor. "Your mother worked very hard to get you this scholarship," he said, his voice low enough that only Elijah could hear. "Make the most of it." Elijah nodded. He knew exactly how hard his mother had worked, the double shifts, the overtime, the grant applications filled out at the kitchen table late at night while he pretended to sleep. This chance meant everything. The principal stopped at a door labeled Music and Arts, Mrs. Blackwell. He knocked twice before pushing it open. Inside, 25 students sat in neat rows, their attention now shifting to the doorway where Elijah stood frozen. "Mrs. Blackwell, this is our new student, Elijah Johnson," Principal Wilson announced. At the front of the classroom stood Mrs. Blackwell, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her pale face. Her eyes, small and sharp like a bird's, looked Elijah up and down. Her smile didn't reach those eyes. "How interesting," she said, putting down her chalk. "We rarely get transfers mid-semester." Principal Wilson gave Elijah a gentle push forward. "I'll leave you to it then." The door closed behind him with a soft click that felt oddly final. "Well, don't just stand there. Introduce yourself to the class," Mrs. Blackwell commanded, gesturing to the front of the room. Elijah walked slowly, feeling the weight of 25 stairs. He turned to face the class, his throat suddenly dry. "I'm Elijah," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm from East Side. I just moved to this district with my mom." "Speak up, boy," Mrs. Blackwell interrupted, "and tell us something interesting about yourself. Surely there must be something." A few students snickered. Elijah's cheeks burned. "I like music," he said, this time louder. "I listen to all kinds. Classical too." Mrs. Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "Classical music? Really?" Her tone made it clear she didn't believe him. "How enlightened. And what composers might you be familiar with?" "Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin," Elijah replied, gaining a bit of confidence. "I like Chopin the most." Something flickered across Mrs. Blackwell's face, surprise, perhaps, or annoyance at being caught in her assumption. She quickly recovered. "Well, we'll see how much you actually know, won't we?" she said, her lips forming a tight smile. "Take a seat at the back. We don't have assigned textbooks for new students, so you'll have to share with someone. Try to keep up." Elijah made his way to the only empty desk, aware of the curious glances following him. A girl with braided hair slid her textbook to the edge of her desk so he could see it too. She gave him a small smile, the first genuine one he'd seen all day. As Mrs. Blackwell turned to the blackboard and began writing music notations, Elijah caught sight of the grand piano in the corner of the room. It was beautiful, polished black with gleaming keys that seemed to call to him. For just a moment, he forgot his nervousness, his fingers itching to touch those keys. He didn't notice Mrs. Blackwell watching him from the corner of her eye, her expression calculating. She'd seen his face light up at the sight of the piano, and something about that bothered her deeply. She turned back to the blackboard, pressing her chalk so hard against it that it snapped in her fingers. Elijah Johnson was going to be a problem. She could feel it. 2 weeks had passed since Elijah's first day at Westfield Academy. The hallways no longer felt quite so foreign, though he still walked them with caution, like someone crossing thin ice. He'd made one friend, Zoe, the girl with braided hair who'd shared her textbook. She'd invite him to sit with her at lunch, saving him from eating alone. But Mrs. Blackwell's classroom remained hostile territory. Each time Elijah entered room 103, the air seemed to chill. The music teacher's eyes would follow him to his seat, watching, waiting for a mistake. Tuesday morning arrived with rain pattering against the classroom windows. Mrs. Blackwell wrote "Quel composers" the maesters across the blackboard in her perfect, slanted handwriting. Today, she announced, turning to face the class, we discussed the geniuses who shaped classical music, people whose brilliance and cultural refinement created works that have lasted centuries. Her gaze drifted toward Elijah as she added, works that require a certain background to truly appreciate. She clicked on a slideshow, and the face of Mozart appeared on screen. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, she began, born into a musical family in Salzburg, Austria, showed prodigious ability from his earliest childhood. By 5, he was composing pieces of music. Elijah leaned forward slightly. He knew about Mozart from the old documentary his neighbor Mr. Reynolds had shown him last year. The elderly man had been a music teacher before retiring and often invited Elijah over to listen to his record collection. Mrs. Blackwell continued through her presentation, discussing Mozart's upbringing, his education, his early performances for European royalty. When she paused to ask if there were questions, Elijah raised his hand before he could think better of it. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. Yes, Elijah? You have a question about Mozart? Yes, ma'am. I was wondering if you'd talk about how he wrote his Requiem Mass, the one he didn't finish before he died. The classroom went quiet. Mrs. Blackwell's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She hadn't expected this. I doubt, she said finally, her voice sharp as a pin, that someone from your background would understand the complexities of Mozart's Requiem. It's a sophisticated piece with Latin text and Catholic symbolism. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Zoe shot Elijah a sympathetic glance. I've heard it, though, Elijah said softly, not wanting to back down. The Lacrimosa part is beautiful. Mrs. Blackwell's cheeks flushed red. That's enough. Let's move on to Beethoven. The rest of class passed in a blur of tension. When the bell rang, Elijah gathered his things quickly, wanting to escape, but Mrs. Blackwell's voice cut through the noise. Tomorrow, she announced loudly, we will have a surprise talent showcase. Everyone should prepare to demonstrate their musical knowledge or ability. Her eyes locked onto Elijah. Everyone. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed worrying. His mother noticed at breakfast. What's wrong, baby? She asked, setting down a plate of toast. You've hardly touched your food. Nothing, Mama. Just a test today. She kissed the top of his head. You'll do fine. You're the smartest boy I know. He wished he could believe her. When Elijah entered music class the next day, the room had been rearranged. Chairs formed a semicircle around the grand piano, which now stood prominently at the front. Mrs. Blackwell smiled, a real smile, which somehow seemed worse than her usual frown. Take your seats, everyone, she said cheerfully. For our talent showcase, I'll call on you randomly. No one believed it would be random. Elijah Johnson, she called first, confirming everyone's suspicion. You'll start us off. You mentioned Mozart yesterday. Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your appreciation at the piano? Whispers rippled through the class. Zoe gave his arm a squeeze as he stood. Elijah's legs felt wobbly as he approached the piano, that beautiful instrument he'd been admiring from afar for 2 weeks. Show us what you know about music, Mrs. Blackwell said with a smirk, loud enough for everyone to hear. She folded her arms, leaning against her desk with the satisfied look of someone about to witness a train wreck. Elijah sat at the piano bench, his heart hammering against his ribs. The keys before him gleamed white and black in the classroom's fluorescent lighting. He placed his hands on them, feeling their cool smoothness under his fingertips. The room held its breath. Someone coughed. Mrs. Blackwell's smile widened, waiting for the disaster, for the fumbling notes that would prove her right. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of the old upright piano at the community center where Mr. Reynolds volunteered, of the hours he'd spent there after school, teaching himself to play while his mother worked, of the YouTube tutorials he'd watched on the library computers. Then, without another thought, he began to play. His fingers found the opening notes of Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu, delicate at first, then building into a cascade of sound that filled every corner of the suddenly silent classroom. The first notes floated through the classroom like butterflies, delicate, hesitant, beautiful. Then Elijah's fingers picked up speed, dancing across the keys with growing confidence. The complex melody of Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu flowed from his hands as naturally as breathing. Mrs. Blackwell's smug smile froze on her face. Her arms, once crossed confidently over her chest, slowly fell to her sides. The look in her eyes shifted from satisfaction to confusion, then to disbelief. The other students sat motionless, mouths slightly open. No one had expected this, least of all from the quiet new kid from the other side of town. Zoe's eyes widened with each passing second, a hand covering her mouth in surprise. Elijah's eyes remained closed, his body swaying gently with the music. The grand piano responded to his touch like a living thing, its sound fuller and richer than the old upright at the community center. His fingers stumbled once on a particularly difficult passage, but he recovered quickly, pushing through with the determination that had gotten him this far. As he played, Elijah's mind drifted back to the first time he'd heard this piece. Mr. Reynolds had played it on an old record player, the scratchy vinyl somehow making the music feel more real, more human. "This is music that speaks to the soul," the old man had told him. "It doesn't matter where you come from or what you look like. If you feel it here," he tapped his chest, "you can play it." Now, as the final notes hung in the air of room 103, Elijah opened his eyes to find 26 faces staring at him in complete shock. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then someone in the back whispered, "Whoa." The spell broke. The classroom erupted in applause. Students jumped to their feet, clapping and cheering. A boy in the front row let out an impressed whistle. "That was amazing. How did you learn to play like that?" Did you see Mrs. Blackwell's face? The voices blurred together as Elijah sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his heart pounding. He looked up at Mrs. Blackwell, who stood rooted to the spot, her face drained of color. She started, then stopped. For once, the strict music teacher seemed at a loss for words. Her hand fluttered to her throat, and she cleared it twice before speaking again. That was unexpected. She walked slowly toward the piano, her heels clicking against the floor in the now quiet room. The students watched, waiting to see what would happen next. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Mrs. Blackwell asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah shifted on the bench. "At the community center," he said, "they have an old piano. Mr. Reynolds, he used to teach music before he retired. He lets me use it after school." "And who taught you this piece?" "Nobody, ma'am. I watched videos online." "At the library?" Mrs. Blackwell's face twitched with something unreadable. "You taught yourself? From videos?" Elijah nodded, suddenly feeling like he'd done something wrong. Mrs. Blackwell seemed to struggle with what to say next. "That's quite remarkable." She turned away abruptly, facing the class again. "Well, I think we've had enough excitement for one day." Class dismissed. Early. Students exchanged surprised glances. Mrs. Blackwell never ended class early. "But what about the rest of the talent showcase?" someone asked. "Another time," she said sharply. "Just go." As chairs scraped and students gathered their things, excited whispers filled the room. Several paused to pat Elijah on the shoulder or give him a thumbs up. Zoe waited by the door, beaming with pride for her friend. Elijah stood from the piano bench, carefully closing the lid over the keys with a quiet reverence. When he turned to leave, he found Mrs. Blackwell watching him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said politely, not sure what else to say. She didn't respond, just continued to stare as if seeing him for the first time. As Elijah walked toward the door where Zoe waited, Mrs. Blackwell finally spoke. "Johnson," she called, her voice lacking its usual edge. He turned back. "That last section, where your left hand stumbled, you rushed the tempo." Elijah nodded, accepting the criticism. "Yes, ma'am." "I know, it's the hardest part." "Come in during lunch tomorrow," she said, arranging papers on her desk without looking at him. "I'll show you how to approach it differently." Was this an olive branch? Elijah wasn't sure, but he nodded again. "Yes, ma'am." Walking down the hallway with Zoe afterward, the world felt different somehow. "That was incredible." Zoe gushed. Why didn't you tell me you could play like that? Elijah shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. Nobody ever asked. By lunchtime, word had spread throughout Westfield Academy. Students he'd never spoken to before stopped him in the hallway to talk. Teachers who had barely noticed him now looked at him with interest. And somewhere in the teacher's lounge, Mrs. Blackwell sat alone with a sandwich untouched, staring out the window, forced to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the boy from the other side of town. The hallways buzzed with excited chatter as lunch period began. Elijah found himself surrounded by curious classmates as he tried to make his way to the cafeteria. A tall boy wearing a basketball jersey clapped him on the shoulder. Dude, that was sick. Where'd you learn to play like that? Before Elijah could answer, another student chimed in. My sister's in your music class. She texted me about what happened. Said Mrs. Blackwell looked like she'd seen a ghost. Elijah smiled shyly. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. Thanks, I just practice a lot. Zoe appeared at his side, linking her arm through his. Come on, piano man. Let's eat before lunch is over. As they walked away, Elijah heard whispers trailing behind them. For once, they weren't the unkind whispers he'd grown accustomed to during his first 2 weeks. These were filled with admiration and surprise. Can you believe he taught himself? I heard he's never had a lesson. Mrs. Blackwell tried to make him look bad, but it totally backfired. In the cafeteria, Zoe and Elijah found a table by the window. 3 other students Elijah recognized from music class asked if they could join them. Before long, their table was full of kids asking questions about his playing, his favorite composers, how long he'd been practicing. Since I was 9, Elijah explained, picking at his sandwich. My mom works a lot, so I'd go to the community center after school. They have this old piano that nobody really used. Mr. Reynolds noticed me watching some older kids plinking on it one day, and he asked if I wanted to try. And he taught you? A girl with glasses asked. Elijah shook his head. Not exactly. He showed me the basics, how to sit properly, where middle C is, stuff like that. But mostly he just let me use the piano whenever I wanted. He'd play these old records while I practiced. That's how I learned about classical music. But how did you learn Chopin? Zoe asked. That piece is super hard. YouTube, Elijah grinned. The library computers. I'd watch videos of people playing it over and over. Then I'd try to copy what their hands were doing when I got back to the piano. A voice crackled over the intercom. Elijah Johnson, please report to the principal's office. Elijah Johnson to the principal's office. The table fell silent. Zoe squeezed his hand. What do you think they want? Elijah's stomach tightened. Had Mrs. Blackwell reported him for something? Was he in trouble? I don't know, he said, gathering his things. Guess I'll find out. The walk to Principal Wilson's office felt like the longest of his life. When he arrived, the secretary smiled warmly at him. Go right in, honey. They're waiting for you. They? Elijah pushed open the heavy door to find not only Principal Wilson behind his desk, but Mrs. Blackwell sitting stiffly in one of the chairs opposite. And there, in the other chair, Mama? Elijah's voice cracked with surprise. His mother turned, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She was still wearing her nurse's scrubs. She must have come straight from her shift at the hospital. That's my boy, she said, opening her arms. Principal Wilson stood, gesturing to an empty chair. Have a seat, Elijah. Don't worry, you're not in any trouble. Quite the opposite. Elijah sat nervously, glancing between the 3 adults. His mother looked proud but confused, like she'd been pulled away from work without much explanation. Mrs. Blackwell stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Elijah, Principal Wilson began, Mrs. Blackwell has informed me about what happened in music class today. His mother turned to him. What happened? The school called saying there was something important they needed to discuss about you, but they wouldn't tell me what over the phone. Elijah looked down at his hands. We had a talent showcase. Mrs. Blackwell asked me to play the piano. And play he did, Principal Wilson said, his voice warm with admiration. Mrs. Blackwell tells me his performance was exceptional. Isn't that right, Mrs. Blackwell? The music teacher cleared her throat. Yes, she said quietly. It was extraordinary, especially considering he's had no formal training. His mother's brow furrowed. Is that what this is about? Elijah's been tinkering on that old piano at the community center for years. Mr. Reynolds lets him practice there. Mrs. Johnson, Principal Wilson leaned forward, clasping his hands on his desk. Your son played Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu today. That's a piece university-level piano students struggle with, and from what Mrs. Blackwell tells me, he played it beautifully. Mostly beautifully, Mrs. Blackwell corrected. There were technical errors, naturally. But the musicality was— She paused, seeming to struggle with her words. Undeniable. Elijah's mother looked at him with wide eyes. Is this true? He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. It sounded better on that piano than at the center. It's a really nice piano. Principal Wilson chuckled. Mrs. Johnson, your son has a remarkable gift. The kind of natural talent we rarely see. With proper training, there's no telling how far he could go. Proper training costs money, his mother said quietly. Money we don't have. That's why he's been teaching himself. Mrs. Blackwell shifted in her seat. There are scholarships, she said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. For talented students, private lessons, summer music programs. She glanced at Elijah briefly. I have connections with the conservatory downtown. Principal Wilson nodded. That's precisely why we called you in, Mrs. Johnson. We'd like to discuss some opportunities for Elijah, ways to nurture this talent of his. As the adults continued talking about practice schedules and auditions and recitals, Elijah sat quietly, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. For the first time since coming to Westfield Academy, he felt like he belonged. And Mrs. Blackwell, whose cold eyes had followed him since day one, was now suggesting teachers who might work with him. Her voice was different when she spoke about music, softer, more passionate. In those moments, looking at her profile as she described the conservatory's youth program, Elijah caught a glimpse of who she might have been before bitterness hardened her heart. Perhaps, he thought, music really could change everything. The next morning, Dr. Howard arrived at his office earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the empty school parking lot. He unlocked his office door, switched on the lights, and settled behind his desk to review the notes he'd made after yesterday's meeting with Elijah and his mother. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He glanced up to find Mrs. Blackwell standing in the doorway, her usual perfect posture somehow more rigid than normal. You wanted to see me, Principal Howard? Her voice was clipped, professional. Yes, Patricia. Come in, please. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Coffee? She shook her head, sitting down stiffly. I prefer to get straight to the point. Dr. Howard sighed, removing his glasses and placing them carefully on the desk. Very well. I think we need to discuss what happened in your classroom yesterday. If this is about the Johnson boys' piano scholarship, I've already made some calls too. This isn't about Elijah's musical future, Dr. Howard interrupted gently. Though I'm grateful for your efforts there, this is about how we got to this point. Mrs. Blackwell's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not sure I understand. Several students have approached their counselors with concerns about how you've been treating Elijah since he arrived. He held up a hand as she began to protest. And before you say anything, I was in the hallway yesterday. I heard what happened in your classroom. Color rose in Mrs. Blackwell's cheeks. I was merely conducting a talent showcase. Patricia, Dr. Howard's voice remained calm but firm. We've worked together for 15 years. In all that time, have you ever held a surprise talent showcase before? Her eyes dropped to her lap. You singled out that boy to humiliate him, he continued. You made assumptions about his background, his abilities, his worth, all based on what? The color of his skin, the neighborhood he comes from. That's not fair, Mrs. Blackwell said, her voice barely above a whisper. Isn't it? Dr. Howard leaned forward. Would you have treated any other new student the same way? In the silence that followed, they could hear the distant sound of students beginning to arrive for the day, their voices echoing down the still empty hallways. I didn't realize, Mrs. Blackwell began, then stopped. Didn't realize what? How it looked. How it felt. She twisted her wedding ring nervously. I've always held my students to high standards. All of them. There's a difference between high standards and prejudice, Patricia. She flinched as if he'd slapped her. I am not prejudiced. I've devoted my life to teaching music to children of all backgrounds. Then why did you go out of your way to make Elijah feel unwelcome? Why did you try to embarrass him in front of his peers? Mrs. Blackwell opened her mouth to defend herself, then closed it again. For several moments she sat in silence, her face working through a range of emotions. I don't know, she finally admitted, her voice small. When he said he knew about classical music, I just didn't believe him. It seemed unlikely. Because of where he comes from, Dr. Howard pressed. She didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. Patricia, I've known you since you started teaching here. You're one of our most dedicated instructors. But yesterday you weren't at your best. And I need to know it won't happen again, not to Elijah, not to any student who walks through our doors. Mrs. Blackwell nodded slowly, her usual confidence absent. What happens now? That depends on you, Dr. Howard said. I've scheduled a session with our diversity consultant next week. I expect you to attend. And Elijah? What about him? Mrs. Blackwell looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since entering the office. I'm not sure how to move forward, with him specifically. Dr. Howard's expression softened slightly. Start by seeing him, Patricia. Not your assumptions about him, but him. The real boy with the extraordinary gift you witnessed yesterday. Meanwhile, across the school, Elijah stood at his newly assigned locker, trying to remember the combination. Everything felt different today. Students who had previously looked through him now smiled or waved as they passed. A group of 8th grade boys who had snickered at his second-hand uniform now nodded respectfully. Hey, piano guy, one called. You should try out for the talent show next month. For real, you kill it. Elijah smiled shyly. Maybe I will. Zoe appeared beside him, bumping his shoulder playfully. Look at you, Mr. Popular. Stop, Elijah laughed, finally getting his locker open. It's weird. It's deserved, she corrected him. You should have seen Mrs. Blackwell's face when you started playing. I thought she was going to pass out. The smile faded from Elijah's face. I have her class after lunch. Aren't you nervous? He nodded, grabbing his science textbook. What if she hates me even more now? For making her look bad. Zoe considered this as they walked to their first class. I don't think she hates you. I think, she paused, searching for the right words. I think maybe you surprised her. People don't like having their ideas about others proved wrong. But why did she have those ideas in the first place? Elijah asked quietly. She didn't even know me. Zoe had no answer for that. When lunchtime came, Elijah found himself hesitating outside the music room door. Mrs. Blackwell had told him to come practice during lunch, but that was before everything had exploded into this bigger situation with the principal and his mother. Would the offer still stand? Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room was empty except for Mrs. Blackwell, who sat at her desk grading papers. She looked up as he entered, her expression cautious. You came, she said, sounding mildly surprised. You said to, Elijah replied simply. About the left hand in the middle section. Something flickered across Mrs. Blackwell's face, surprise, perhaps, or respect. She nodded, setting down her red pen. Yes, well, let's see what we can do about that passage. She stood and walked to the piano, gesturing for him to join her. Show me how you've been approaching it. A month passed. The leaves on the oak trees lining Westfield Academy's driveway turned golden, then fell, carpeting the ground in autumn colors. Inside the music room, Elijah's fingers danced across the piano keys, coaxing out the delicate melody of Debussy's Clair de Lune. When the final notes faded, he looked up at Mrs. Blackwell, who stood beside the piano with her arms crossed. Better, she said, her tone businesslike but not unkind. Your phrasing in the middle section has improved, but you're still rushing the tempo in the final part. Elijah nodded, making a small note in his music book. I get excited near the end. A hint of a smile touched Mrs. Blackwell's lips. Enthusiasm is good. Control is better. She glanced at the clock. That's enough for today. Same time tomorrow? Yes, ma'am. As Elijah gathered his sheet music, he marveled at how much had changed. For the past month, he'd been coming to the music room during lunch 3 days a week. Mrs. Blackwell had been true to her word about helping him with technique, and though she remained strict, the cruelty had vanished from her voice. It wasn't exactly warmth between them, more like a careful professional respect. She never mentioned the incident that had started it all, and neither did he. Instead, they'd focused on the music, speaking the universal language they both understood. Outside the music room, Zoe waited, munching on an apple. "How'd it go today?" "Good," Elijah said, falling into step beside her. She said my phrasing is better. High praise from the dragon lady. "She's not that bad," Elijah found himself saying. "Not anymore anyway." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "Stockholm Syndrome much?" Elijah laughed. "I'm serious. She knows a lot about music. And she's been helping me prepare for the conservatory audition next month." Still weirded, Zoe muttered, but she dropped the subject as they entered the crowded cafeteria. Later that afternoon, flyers appeared on bulletin boards throughout the school. Westfield Academy Annual Spring Concert, Friday, May 12th, 7:00 p.m. Featuring performances by the Westfield Orchestra, choir, and select soloists. Reception to follow in the main hall. Students gathered around the notices, checking to see which groups would be performing. The spring concert was one of the biggest events of the school year, attended by parents, faculty, and alumni. Being selected as a soloist was considered a high honor. Elijah glanced at the flyer but didn't give it much thought. As a new student, he wouldn't be eligible for a solo spot. Besides, his focus was on the upcoming conservatory audition. If he got accepted into their weekend program, he'd finally get the formal training he needed. The final bell rang, and Elijah headed for the exit. As he passed the music room, Mrs. Blackwell stepped into the hallway. "Johnson," she called. "A moment, please." Curious, Elijah followed her back into the classroom. She closed the door and walked to her desk, her posture as rigid as always. "I wanted to ask you something," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "About the spring concert." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Blackwell fidgeted with a pencil, uncharacteristically nervous. "The committee has been selecting performers and, well, I've put your name forward as a piano soloist." Elijah's eyes widened. "Me? But I thought only students who'd been here at least a year could perform solos." "Exceptions can be made, for exceptional talent." She set the pencil down with deliberate care. "Would you be interested?" "Yes," Elijah blurted, then composed himself. "I mean, yes, ma'am, I would." "Thank you." Mrs. Blackwell nodded, still not quite looking at him. "Good. We'll need to select an appropriate piece. Something challenging but not." She trailed off, then finally raised her eyes to his. "Elijah, there's something else I need to say." The use of his first name startled him. In all their sessions, she'd never called him anything but Johnson. Mrs. Blackwell took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology." The room grew very quiet. Outside, they could hear students chatting as they left for the day, but inside the music room, time seemed to stand still. "When you first came to my class, I made assumptions about you," she continued, her voice steady but softer than usual. "Unfair assumptions. I treated you poorly because of those assumptions, and that was wrong of me." Elijah stood frozen, unsure how to respond. "Your talent, it forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself," Mrs. Blackwell admitted. "I've always prided myself on recognizing musical potential wherever I found it. But with you, I didn't even look. I didn't want to see it." She straightened a stack of papers on her desk, a nervous gesture. "These past weeks, working with you, I've been reminded of why I became a music teacher in the first place. Not to drill scales into reluctant students, but to nurture real passion when I find it." She looked up at him directly. "You have that passion, Elijah, and I nearly missed it because I couldn't see past my own limitations." Elijah swallowed hard. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Blackwell." "The conservatory audition is just the beginning for you," she continued, regaining her composure. "With proper training, there's no telling how far you could go. And I'd like to help you get there if you'll allow it." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just duty or obligation speaking, but genuine regret and a desire to make amends. "I'd like that," Elijah said simply. Mrs. Blackwell nodded, relief washing over her features. "Good. Now, about the spring concert. I was thinking perhaps the Rachmaninoff Prelude in G minor. It's challenging, but I believe you're ready for it." As they discussed the technical aspects of the piece, something shifted between them, not quite friendship, but a bridge being built where once there had been only a chasm. The music they both loved became a path forward, a way to heal old wounds and create something new and beautiful. Later, as Elijah walked home in the golden afternoon light, he felt lighter somehow. His mother had always told him that true strength wasn't just in standing up for yourself, but in forgiving those who had wronged you, not for their sake, but for your own peace. Today, he understood what she meant. The night of the spring concert arrived with a gentle rain that made the school windows glow like lanterns in the dusk. Behind the stage curtain, Elijah peeked out at the filling auditorium. Every seat was taken, with latecomers standing along the back wall. His stomach tightened into knots. Nervous, Elijah turned to find Mrs. Blackwell standing behind him, dressed in an elegant black dress instead of her usual tweed skirt and blouse. She looked different somehow, less severe, more human. A little, he admitted, tugging at the sleeves of his borrowed suit jacket. It was slightly too big, a last-minute loan from Dr. Howard when they realized Elijah didn't own formal wear. Good, Mrs. Blackwell said, surprising him. A touch of nerves keeps you sharp. Just remember to breathe. She handed him a program. His name was listed last among the soloists, Elijah Johnson, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. We saved the best for last, Mrs. Blackwell said quietly. For the next hour, Elijah sat in the wings, listening as the orchestra played selections from Mozart and Beethoven, as the choir sang folk songs and spirituals, as other soloists performed their pieces. The audience applauded politely after each performance. "Your mom here?" Mrs. Blackwell asked during a brief intermission. Elijah nodded. Front row. She switched shifts with someone to be here. Mrs. Blackwell seemed about to say something else when the stage manager approached. "You're up next, Elijah. Ready?" His heart hammered against his ribs. "I think so." As the current performer finished to scattered applause, Elijah stood in the darkness just offstage, wiping his sweaty palms on his pants. The stage manager motioned him forward. Walking onto the bright stage felt like stepping into another world. The sea of faces blurred except for one, his mother in the front row, still in her nurse's scrubs, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Next to her sat Mr. Reynolds, the elderly neighbor who had first showed him the beauty of classical music. Elijah took his place at the grand piano, bigger and more magnificent than the one in the music room. He adjusted the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and took a deep breath. Before starting, he leaned toward the microphone. "I'd like to dedicate this performance to my mother, who works night shifts but managed to be here tonight." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "And to those who taught me that music speaks where words fail." His eyes found Mrs. Blackwell standing in the wings, and he held her gaze for a moment before turning back to the piano. Then his fingers touched the keys, and everything else fell away. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Prelude filled the auditorium, somber, thoughtful, building gradually like a gathering storm. Elijah's body swayed slightly as his hands moved across the keyboard, no longer conscious of technique or tempo, simply feeling the music flow through him like a river. The middle section came, the part that had given him so much trouble in practice. Mrs. Blackwell had shown him how to approach it differently, breaking it down into smaller phrases, focusing on the emotion rather than the notes. Now his left hand moved confidently through the complex passages, his right adding the delicate melody above. As the music built toward its thunderous climax, Elijah closed his eyes, letting himself be carried away by the tide of sound. The final chords resonated through the hall, powerful yet precise, exactly as Mrs. Blackwell had taught him. And then, the gentle resolution, like waves receding from the shore. The last note hung in the air for one perfect moment of silence. Then the audience erupted. The applause was immediate and overwhelming, people rising to their feet in a wave. His mother was the first to stand, tears streaming freely down her face now, her hands clapping above her head. Mr. Reynolds beside her was beaming, nodding as if to say, "I always knew." Dr. Howard stood in the back, applauding vigorously. And there, off to the side, Mrs. Blackwell watched with an expression Elijah had never seen on her face before, pride, unguarded and genuine. Elijah stood from the bench and bowed as he'd been taught. The applause grew louder. Someone whistled. A few people shouted bravo. As he straightened, he caught Mrs. Blackwell's eye again. She gave him a small nod, and in that gesture was everything they'd never said aloud. Acknowledgement of past wrongs. appreciation for talent recognized, and the shared joy of music that had built a bridge between them. After the concert, the reception in the main hall buzzed with excited conversation. Elijah found himself surrounded by well-wishers, students, parents, teachers all wanting to congratulate him. "That was beautiful, baby," his mother said when she finally reached him, pulling him into a tight hug that smelled of hospital disinfectant and her familiar perfume. "Your daddy would have been so proud." Elijah blinked back tears at the mention of his father, gone 5 years now. "Thanks, Mama." Mr. Reynolds patted his shoulder. "Told you that boy had something special," he said to Elijah's mother. "First time I heard him picking out melodies on that old piano, I knew." As the crowd thinned, Mrs. Blackwell approached, accompanied by an elegant older man Elijah didn't recognize. "Elijah, this is Professor Thomas Chen from the conservatory," she said. "He's the head of their youth program." The professor shook Elijah's hand warmly. "Mrs. Blackwell has told me about your remarkable talent. After hearing you tonight, I can see she wasn't exaggerating." "Thank you, sir," Elijah said, his eyes wide. "We'd like to offer you a place in our Saturday program," Professor Chen continued. "Full scholarship, of course, and private lessons during the week, if you're interested." Elijah looked at his mother, who nodded, her eyes still shining. "We're interested," she said firmly. As they discussed details of the program, Elijah couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in just a few months. He'd come to Westfield as an outsider, faced prejudice and doubt, and somehow found his path forward through music. And Mrs. Blackwell, the teacher who had once tried to humiliate him, had become an unlikely champion. Later, as they prepared to leave, Elijah found himself alone with her for a moment. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Mrs. Blackwell smiled. A real smile that softened her entire face. "You did all the hard work, Elijah. I just opened a door." "Still, it means a lot." She nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Perhaps we both learned something important." As Elijah walked out into the cool spring night with his mother, her arm around his shoulders, he thought about the power of music to change hearts and minds. One song had altered the course of his life. One performance had transformed a relationship built on prejudice into one of mutual respect. It wasn't perfect. The world wasn't suddenly fixed, but it was a beginning. A single note in what might become a beautiful melody.